On the broadcast tonight, what did he know? Explosive new allegations about Chris Christie. Tonight, the man at the center of the bridge shutdown scandal says the governor isn't telling the whole truth. He says there's evidence to prove it. Desperate measures. California orders emergency water cutbacks as a dire state of emergency gets even worse now. Entire communities may not get any more water. If you only knew, a TSA insider's revealing new confession, what he says was really going on at the airport security line, exactly what so many of us passengers had feared. And taking a hit on the Super Bowl weekend, American attitudes toward the game are changing when parents are asked the question, would you let your kids play? Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. A former appointee of Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey says he has evidence the governor knew of the forced slowdown on the George Washington Bridge between New Jersey and New York while it was going on, and that he's prepared to prove it. Despite the governor's repeated denial tonight, this scandal has again engulfed Chris Christie, embarrassingly on the eve of the Super Bowl, the first ever held in New Jersey. Tonight, the state's leading newspaper is saying if this is true, the governor must resign. And Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz said tonight Chris Christie needs to hire a criminal lawyer if he hasn't already. NBC's Katie Turr starts us off tonight in the shadow of the GW Bridge, which has been lit up for the big game just 11 miles away. Katie, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. That appointee is David Wildstein. It's important to note we don't know what the evidence is. The letter didn't specify. Also important to note that his lawyer is trying to get his legal fees paid for. But if this is substantiated, you have to wonder, how can Chris Christie survive this?
David Wildstein.
Late this afternoon, a lawyer for David Wildstein, the former Port Authority official embroiled in the George Washington Bridge lane closure scandal, released a letter disputing Chris Christie's claim that he didn't know anything about it.
Let me tell you, everybody, I was blindsided yesterday morning.
In the letter, Wildstein's lawyer argues the governor not only knew about the closures, but described them as, quote, the Christie administration's order, writing, evidence exists as well tying Mr. Christie to having knowledge of the lane closures during the period when the lanes were closed, contrary to what the governor stated publicly in a 2-hour press conference.
This is a hugely significant development in the investigation. It's a direct challenge to the credibility of Governor Christie. But until we see the evidence that David Wildstein is talking about, it's very hard to know how to evaluate.
On January 9th, in that press conference, Christie adamantly denied knowing about, not to mention okaying, what he called a political vendetta.
I am humiliated by the fact that I did not know this and that I was deceived. And that's an awful way to feel.
Wildstein, who was appointed by Christie, had already resigned from the Port Authority when he appeared at a hearing in front of the New Jersey State Assembly, but wouldn't answer any questions.
On the advice of my counsel, I respectfully assert my right to remain silent.
What did the governor know, and when did he know it, have been the key questions since documents were released showing Christie's now former Deputy Chief of Staff, Bridget Ann Kelly, sent an email to Wildstein saying, time for some traffic problems in Fort Lee. Wildstein replied, got it. New Jersey lawmakers conducting their own investigation issued 20 subpoenas seeking documents from Christie's current and former top aides and his re-election campaign. Responses to those subpoenas are due next week. Assemblyman John Wisniewski is leading the investigation.
I don't know what documents he's referring to. We had subpoenaed documents from him. I'm a little frustrated as committee chair that we had asked for documents from him through a valid subpoena. He provided us over 900 pages, and apparently the documents he's referring to were not part of that response.
And the voices are only going to get louder after this. Forget presidential hopes, Brian. Many are now saying that if this is proved, he should resign or be impeached.
Katie Turr starting us off on the New York side of the GW Bridge tonight. Katie, thanks. And as we said, the governor has responded to this charge late today in the form of a statement. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell has been covering the governor and this story since it's broke. She is in our Washington newsroom tonight. Hey, Kelly, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. So after all of this erupted, the governor's administration, not Chris Christie personally, but his office, reacted to these new allegations and again denied that the governor knew anything about a political deliberate operation that might have been behind the bridge traffic jam. Knowing about the traffic is different than knowing there was an operation to bring it about. So the statement reads, in part, Mr. Wildstein's lawyer confirms that what the governor has said all along. He had absolutely no prior knowledge of the lane closures before they happened, and whatever Mr. Wildstein's motivations were for closing them to begin with. Now, the statement then goes on to say that Christie had no indication that this was anything other than a traffic study until he read otherwise the morning of January 8th. The governor denies Mr. Wildstein's lawyers' other assertions. So Christie's office is raising the specter of the former Port Authority officials' motivations. For example, looking for criminal immunity. And the lawyer's letter explicitly asks that Wildstein's legal fees be paid for by his former employer, the Port Authority, and not out of his own pocket. The timing is also interesting because these new allegations come just as Christie is arguably getting some more favorable media attention as his state hosts the Super Bowl and before Monday's deadline when the responses to those subpoenas are due. Brian?
Kelly O'Donnell in D.C. tonight. Kelly, thanks. Now to the West Coast. California officials announced late today they have ordered emergency water cutbacks because of the epic drought we showed you here last night. Officials say water from the state's reservoir system to local agencies will soon be cut off, and that'll affect 25 million people. Nothing like this has ever happened before. NBC's Miguel Almaguer is at the reservoir just above San Jose tonight.
Brian, good evening. This reservoir used to be a major resource, but now look at it. It's more junkyard than it is watershed. When the water levels here dropped, garbage like this surfaced. And while this reservoir needs to be cleaned up, more than anything, it needs rain.
In a state where water is liquid gold, these are desperate times. With reservoirs empty and creeks dry, at Lake Oroville, the water supply has dropped more than 2 feet this month alone. Today, the Department of Water Resources said there's not enough water to go around. The agency will turn off the tap to distributors who serve 25 million customers and 750,000 acres of farmland.
Today's actions mean that everyone, farmers, fish, people in our cities and towns, will get less water as a result. But these actions will protect us all better in the long run.
Californians will get water from other sources, but they'll get less of it and pay more for it. Ken Christensen says his business is underwater. At his marina in Folsom, there's been no rain or customers for months.
The financial impact is devastating here. I do not think we're going to open this year. The docks you see behind me will probably never see water.
For the Glass family, citrus growers since 1907, their harvest and their trees are at stake.
With citrus, if you don't have water to keep them alive, you lose 30-year-old trees in their prime. A year off, they'd be done. We'd have to start over.
Each day without rain, more records are set. This month, Los Angeles had no measurable rain, only 1 of 5 Januaries since 1878.
Right now in California, we are experiencing a drought that no living person in this state or in this country has experienced before in terms of its severity.
A crippling drought with an economic impact that will ripple around the world.
Reservoirs across California look just like this, those deep cracks in the floor. Experts say even if we got heavy rain and snow every other day until May, California would still be in serious trouble. Brian?
Miguel Almaguer, San Jose, California for us tonight. Miguel, thanks. A hot topic in American politics just got more interesting where President Obama is concerned. It has to do with the Keystone Pipeline from Canada to the U.S. Gulf Coast, and just tonight, a long-delayed environmental impact report could remove a major hurdle for its approval. We get our late report tonight from NBC's Andrea Mitchell.
It is a classic battle. The oil industry arguing jobs and energy independence versus environmentalists worried about oil spills, wildlife, and climate change. The pipeline would stretch for 875 miles from Montana on the Canadian border to Steel City, Nebraska, delivering 830,000 barrels a day of thick tar sands crude oil onto the Gulf Coast. President Obama, trailed for months by anti-pipeline protesters, had promised he wouldn't approve it if it would accelerate climate change.
Our national interest will be served only if this project does not significantly exacerbate the problem of carbon pollution.
Today's report says it won't have an effect on the environment either way. Approval or denial of one crude oil project remains unlikely to significantly impact demand for heavy crude oil, the oil that creates the worst pollution. In other words, this oil will be produced whether the pipeline is built or not. Pipeline advocates say President Obama now has no excuse not to go ahead.
We spent over 5 years on the environment. Time and time again, it shows no environmental impact.
What about jobs? The report says the pipeline would produce 3,900 temporary construction jobs for 1 year in Montana, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, and 50 permanent jobs. And it states that of 14 protected or endangered species like the whooping crane, only one, a beetle, would be adversely affected. Not so, say opponents.
If ever there's a spill, of course countless animals can be impacted, and the greatest threat to wildlife is climate change.
Environmentalists point to spills like this one, an old pipeline north of Little Rock last March, still not cleaned up.
There's an enormous amount of political pressure within the Beltway to approve this project. And I think around the country, people understand that this is actually a terrible idea.
Environmentalists are also crying foul because they charge that the consultants who worked on today's final report had ties to the pipeline company. A State Department Inspector General is investigating alleged conflict of interest. Ryan?
Andrea Mitchell in D.C. tonight. Andrea, thanks. As millions of viewers around this globe get ready to watch the Super Bowl on Sunday, this comes at what may be the start of a troubling time for organized football. This week, Joe Namath became the latest big-name player to disclose he's suffering long-term effects from concussions during his career. It's significant that our latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll has now discovered a startling number on public attitudes toward the number one sport in this country. When asked if they would discourage a child from playing football, 40% of Americans said yes. Because this came out of our latest polling on mostly political attitudes, we get our report tonight from our political editor and fellow football fan, Chuck Todd.
On Sunday, more than 100 million Americans will watch the Super Bowl. But while we love watching the game, we're beginning to question whether it's safe for our kids to play it.
To be honest with you, I'm probably going to stop. I know they really love it, and they keep bugging me about it.
Green Bay Packer great Brett Favre has questioned whether the game is even safe enough for kids.
If I had a son, I would be real leery of him playing.
And the President of the United States told the New Yorker magazine, I would not let my son play pro football. And our new poll shows a dramatic class divide on the issue. While 4 in 10 Americans overall would discourage their kids from playing football, the number is closer to 50% among wealthier Americans and near 60% among the most highly educated. NBC sports analyst and former player Chris Collinsworth is concerned this safety fear could decimate youth football.
I think more than ever before, we're seeing football coming down to what the moms in the minivans think. Because if the perception is that it's not safe for their son to play, they talk.
Youth enrollment in Pop Warner football has dropped by nearly 10% in the last 3 years. Though officials claim it has nothing to do with concussion concerns.
Football is relatively safe compared to other youth activities. As I said, that kids get more concussions in a variety of other ways other than playing football.
But like big tobacco in the 60s, many football organizations have been criticized for being too slow to acknowledge the danger. There's now even a class action lawsuit against the association that oversees high school football. And that raises the very real possibility that some high schools may decide to stop sanctioning football altogether for fear of the liability.
I like to hit people.
But Dad's nervous.
Yeah, some keep playing the game, but I think we're, going to have to get a little more educated on concussions, how the concussions are caused, how to prevent them.
Our shared love of football has become a shared national conversation about whether the risk is worth it. Chuck Todd, NBC News, Washington.
Still ahead for us on this Friday night, a TSA insider stunning new claims about what was really going on at airport security, the very same invasion of privacy that so many of us passengers had feared. And later, a spectacular new view of that jump from the edge of space kept hidden from the world, that is, until now. A former airport screening officer at the TSA is revealing inside secrets about how members of the